Okay, so here's our poster for Anthro 118. Our group is Prem, Ethan, Ninus, and Norai. Our topic is the tobacco trade. So to get things started, here's an intro. The introduction of the tobacco plant into America in the 1600s was one of the most significant and impactful events in history. In the New World, as it was called, Jamestown became the first successful colony and settlement. And here, it was the site where tobacco was first grown and cultivated in mass.
Thank you, Ethan, for that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to be starting off with the background portion of this presentation. So for tobacco, a colonist by the name of John Rolfe played a very important role to the introduction of tobacco to the New World. The native Indians in this region had already grown a certain species of tobacco called Nicotimus tabacum in the area, but it was only in small amounts. What happened was these European colonists started to pretty much make huge plantations of tobacco, which really affected the environment. And Rolfe took this to the next level by making huge plantations, and the soil from these fields were actually getting fragile and had fallow periods. After growing the tobacco on the fields, the English colonists didn't wait for the fields to regenerate. So they just kept planting the tobacco instead of turning them into fields of like different crops for maize and either for pasture for cattle and horses. And this is actually better for the fields because it gives it a different time period to change. So for the English colonists who grew tobacco, it was in Jamestown in Virginia, and it changed the whole American landscape and played a very important role influencing many different places around the world through the worldwide phenomenon of tobacco. And it blossomed into a huge industry as we can still see the impacts today in our world. Tobacco is also a sponge for nitrogen and potassium, and this is why also it's bad for the fields because the entire plant pretty much has to be removed from the soil, and harvesting and exporting tobacco was like taking all the nutrients from the ground and just throwing it on a ship. It just sucks the life out of the soil. The soil is pretty fragile. It can ruin the land in a couple of years because of planting tobacco over and over and over again. It just wears out the fields, and the colonists pretty much had to keep moving to a different area in order to grow more tobacco because the area that they already were planting in were already bad.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the development of tobacco. So to start off, King James's first comment about tobacco was that it was loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and harmful to the brain. However, he changed his mind pretty quickly after he realized that he could make money off of it. Um, he started taxing tobacco, and since England was in debt due to war, it was a pretty good opportunity for him to make money. Virginia tobacco was worse in terms of quality compared to Caribbean tobacco, but it was cheaper. In Jamestown, by 1620, the Columbian Exchange was shipping up to 50,000 pounds a year. And after 3 years, that number basically tripled to 150,000 pounds a year. The Chesapeake Bay, which is known as the Tobacco Coast, because it had 25 million pounds being exported a year. The Chesapeake Bay became known as the Tobacco Coast, sorry. Farmers were making profits of about 1,000% on their investments. Um, and since people were obsessed with tobacco, some of the leadership complained that the colonists let Jamestown fail and let it get to ruin. Um, quote, the church down, the palisados broken, the bridge in pieces, the well of fresh water spoiled, the storehouse they used for the church, the marketplace and the streets, and all other places planted with tobacco, end quote. Massive celebratory drunkenness was common. Incoming ships brought liquor and profitably transformed themselves into floating temporary taverns. Um, by growing tobacco, the English had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. Indians had traditionally raised tobacco, but only a small amount. The colonists covered a bunch of the area with the strain that Ninos was talking about. Um, Neither the natives nor the newcomers understood the environmental impact of planting it on such a massive scale, so they just kept doing it. Um, so, as tobacco became increasingly more popular among the English, tobacco cultivation in the American colonies became a strong and powerful economic force. It was a huge success, especially around the Chesapeake Bay. Um, Plantations were built along the riverbank in order to cultivate the cash crop in large quantities. As the tobacco economy grew, the demand for labor was needed in these plantations, which led to people starting to rely on slaves, and which led to the import of African people to help grow the crop. And as mentioned before, the Chesapeake Bay became known as the Tobacco Coast because of the amount of tobacco cultivation that was happening.
Thank you, Noai, for that brief introduction to like the development of tobacco and saying how.
You're quite welcome.
All right, but so I will be getting into slavery and its relation to tobacco. So to begin with, the reason tobacco flourished was due to the free labor coming from slavery. Obviously, slavery was really beneficial, and so they would bring African slaves to work for the tobacco crops. This was part of the famous triangular trade system. As you can see, the big picture in the middle, you can see the flow of slaves to the Americas, and you can see the flow of crops and textiles, depending on how you look at the map. But I thought this picture was really helpful in describing how important and how like impactful just this trade system was. It was benefiting all three countries, and it was so beneficial, like in a way, and that's why tobacco was like part of this system. But as a part of this trading systems, the colonies in America sent sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe. Europe sent textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa, and Africa sent slaves to Americas, which they used heavy labor and demand for tobacco cultivations. Pirates would steal slave ships from Portuguese that were destined to go to other places such as Mexico. From these pirates, the people in the New World would trade food to the pirates for their return journey back to Europe. Jamestown was the start of tradition in America of slavery and free labor, which made the pockets of colonists richer and richer. It came to the point that everyone wanted to grow tobacco for their profit, that it brought orders to Virginia planters that they must grow food crops as well, otherwise they must give up their tobacco to the government. Not only did tobacco add to the slavery problem in the New World, also it was not good for the soil, as mentioned before, tobacco is a sponge for nitrogen and potassium. When harvesting tobacco, the entire plant is removed from the soil, so it is like taking all the nutrients from the soil and putting it on a ship. It sucks the life out of the soil, so colonists would have to move to another plot of land. Basically, if you think about it this way, like the more tobacco you plant on a given area, the less soil that happens, and you only have a certain amount of uses before it's not useful at all. This constantly moved Indians further and further inland and caused colonists to keep on taking their land for new tobacco farms. So it was this relationship of them moving, taking more land, just so they can reap the economic benefits tobacco was allowing them. So now we get into our discussion and basically summarize everything we have told you about today. So first, let's talk about the incorporation of tobacco and its contribution to the development of the New World. So obviously, we've all revealed the triangular trade before. We know its main purpose, and one of the main reasons it was vital for the success of the New World was that tobacco was a vital crop in the triangular trade. Everyone was trying to get in on it. Everyone was trying to get in on the profit, and it catalyzed the growth of plantations, which in turn helped the economic prosperity of the New World. And this is in turn what developed the New World. In discussing the consequences and criticisms with the introduction of tobacco. So, I mean, the most obvious one to me would be The triangle trade model allowed for the swift spread of slavery across the New World. I mean, there's no other way to spread slavery faster than I believe tobacco did. Everyone wanted to get in on the market. Slave labor was the best route for them in terms of reaping the benefits and just getting in. And so in Africa, there was also African leaders who sold their captives and prisoners to European traders. This trade caused a decline in their population, particularly in the population of young men, which led to their economic fragility. And a lot of historians like to say that the triangular trade was actually like inevitably really harmful to Africa, and like some of the damage was very irreversible because it left their content far behind in terms of growth compared to the developing world, and it opened them up for European colonization to come in the 19th century. As stated previously, because tobacco drains the soil of its nutrients, about only 3 successful growing seasons could occur on a plot of land, and then after that, the land had to lie fallow for 3 years before the soil could be used again. Obviously, this is really harmful because they can only use a certain amount of land, and this drives the demand for new farmland. With the introduction of tobacco, there's also an introduction of earthworms, which surprisingly had environmental impacts on the land. Since they were brought over to the New World through the dirt they brought tobacco in, these earthworms were seen as agricultural pests. Earthworms eat their way through the soil. They create networks of tunnels that let water and air in. In temperate places like Virginia, earthworms can in turn turn over the upper foot of soil every 10 or 20 years. In worm-free woodlands, earthworms leave piles and drifts on the forest floor. However, when earthworms are introduced, they can do away with the leaf litter in few months, packing the nutrients in soil in the form of worm excrement, resulting in drastic changes such as before trees and shrubs in wormless places depend on the litter for food, but if worms tuck in nutrients for soil, the plants can't find them. Many species die off. The forest becomes more open and dry, losing its understory, including tree seedings. Meanwhile, earthworms compete for food with small insects driving down their numbers. Birds, lizards, and mammals that feed into the litter also decline. Why is it important? How much influence did tobacco have on the economy, political organization, technology, etc.? So tobacco was a way for colonists to get rich really quick and oppress mainly African Americans, but all groups of people. And it caused these groups of people to become even more oppressed than they already were. As tobacco hurt the Native Americans and the African slaves the most, the Native Americans lost their lands because of crops, and African lost their livelihood and freedom because of it. How might have the New World been different had tobacco not been introduced? Did the contributions outweigh the negative consequences? I think no matter what, I think indentured servants may have been used, or some type of slavery may have been incorporated. Obviously, tobacco didn't introduce slavery, but it definitely catalyzed and promoted slavery in a way. So maybe we'd see fewer settlements spur up as there were less money coming in from the sale and growth of tobacco. On the side of colonists, the position for them outweighed the negatives. Obviously, they were hugely benefiting from using tobacco and from these plantations. But for African Americans and Native Americans, the consequences were terrible. I mean, they lost their land. African Americans didn't even have their freedom. Despite the development of the New World, the shipping of 12.5 African American slaves is not justified at all, in my opinion. I believe when you oppress larger groups of people for economic or political or any type of benefit, there's no justification. And so, how might the New World may have been different? Honestly, there are infinite answers to that question. I mean, Africa could have been a stronger nation. They could have been developing more. I mean, we don't know how much America was, how might I say it? We don't know how much America depended on the triangle trade for their development, or Europe. So a lot could have changed. We wouldn't know, but looking back at it now, like none of it was justified. And so that's kind of our discussion when we're talking about the introduction of tobacco in the New World. And on the bottom, we have our works cited, and that's about it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our presentation. And I hope you guys got to learn a lot about the introduction of tobacco in the New World.